Better by the Numbers podcast. Presented by Life Metrics.
All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Better by the Numbers podcast, the podcast that dives into how doctors are using data, lab testing, and cutting edge science in fresh, forward thinking ways to transform healthcare. I'm your host, Aaron, and today we have Dr. Mai-Lan Ho, a physician, scientist, and educator whose work spans translational imaging, systems neuroscience, and AI for precision health. And also we have Dr. Rich Sidlow, a geneticist at the University of Missouri, and serves on the advisory boards of Guide Genetics and Egetis Pharmaceuticals. Together, they co-authored a paper published earlier this year in Health and Technology titled Unifying the Odyssey, Artificial Intelligence for Rare Disease Diagnosis and Therapy. And we definitely want to get into that and what brought you guys together. So with that said, every doctor has that one case or one test that has stopped them in their tracks, something that reshaped how they think about diagnosis. So what would you say yours was and why did it stick with you?
I guess I'll start. There was a baby that I took care of who had findings on physical exam that were really uncommon. And I felt in my bones that it was a genetic issue, but I didn't know what it is offhand. I couldn't figure it out just by looking at the kid. And it took 2 years and switching out from one job to another before I had access to the testing that I needed to answer this question. And that whole, that, that initial discomfort with not being able to provide the family with those answers that I think they deserved and desperately needed was, paradigm shifting for me. So this one case just sort of, changed my career trajectory permanently.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow.
Yeah, for me, I'm a radiologist, a neuroradiologist. So my background is much more in just overall imaging diagnosis. And I think the training focuses on a lot of the common diseases. But having worked at some of the hospitals that actually are destinations for, genetic genomic sequencing, I was just seeing a lot of unsolved cases that other radiologists were calling normal. And clearly, these children or patients weren't normal, and there was something wrong with them, but no one was giving them that answer. So for me, early in my career, it was this process of really saying, you've got these world famous child neurologists saying something is wrong, but the answers are there. I was convinced that the answers were in all of the testing that had already been done, the sequencing, the imaging, the notes, but I was just waiting for someone to put it together. So I spent a lot of time in my early career just really poring over all of these, hundreds of pages of notes and scrutinizing the images for very subtle features that would not be in the conventional training of a traditional radiologist to try to find those correlates with the genetics. And then I became very interested in the, genotype-phenotype relationship and really looking at those mechanistic pathways to understand that better. So that was really how I started in, medical genetics and imaging genomics.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, that was actually kind of what I was going to dive into next. I know you kind of touched on it already, but can you guys give us a quick sense of like your path into medicine and what pulled you towards genetics and AI specifically?
So, prior to going into genetics, I was a pediatric hospitalist and sort of administrator. Had sort of worn a lot of hats within the hospital and the hospital system that I was working in previously. And on the background, I've always been interested in genetics, but didn't find a way to sort of do the actual formal training. So I sort of was informally spending time with this for several weeks a year, but not having the time to immerse myself in the actual fellowship. And the reason behind it was very simple. Um, Not unlike Dr. Ho, just seeing a lot of cases that I knew had answers, but they were just not forthcoming because the um, doctors and the processes that were in place were just not there to deal with rare disease. And I just at some point just said, I can't do this anymore. I can't stand not having these answers. And I underwent the training and went, did the fellowship. I think I started when I was age 52, and the, the rest is kind of, commentary. I've been doing exactly what I wanted to do for a long time, and, answering questions more often than before.
Yeah, for me, also kind of a non-traditional story. So prior to medicine, I was a chemical engineer, and our training was very much focused on think, don't memorize, which is kind of the opposite of traditional medical training. So there was a lot of really just trying to understand the mechanisms and first principles and reason out from there. And I'm also a classical violinist, so I think I do look at things a little bit differently in terms of connections and, learning and kind of the nonverbal communication and all of those different things. So I think I approached when I did come to medical school, I really came at it from a different angle, a very non-traditional angle. And then radiology really spoke to me because of a lot of the engineering and technology aspects. So that began a kind of lifelong learning process of just understanding more how can we utilize this tool, these imaging technologies, to really scrutinize, because what Dr. Sidlow does is really external phenotyping, right? All of the facial and like dermatologic, ophthalmologic, all of those manifestations. But for the inside, he has to rely on people like me or read the reports and try to put it together, right? And so I'm kind of like the internal phenotyper. In terms of how I got interested in genetics and AI, again, it's kind of what I mentioned earlier. Because I think of the engineering background and maybe even the violin background, I kind of gravitate towards things I don't understand. That's how I got into neuroradiology with the mind-brain connection. It's got how I got into genetics with all of these, very subtle details and really trying to elucidate subtle relationships. And it's also how I ended up getting into AI, because radiology in the healthcare field has kind of led the AI revolution because we have a lot of digital data already stored in our PACS. It's called the PACS system, the Picture Archiving and Communications. So we've been digital for several decades, and so it was the easiest place to deploy within healthcare. So we've seen both the pros and the cons of AI. But based on that background, I started working with data scientists about 7 years ago, and just really trying to partner with them to understand what the pitfalls are, how we can implement AI successfully in healthcare. And then, in the past year, I've been working toward a quantum computing certification. So that's another hot area, I think, for genetics in terms of the chemistry and kind of probabilistic computing as well, particularly for drug discovery and repurposing. So, I mean, I think again, it's just that kind of lifelong curiosity that led me to this point and to work with Rich.
I mean, that's amazing. First of all, the whole you're a violinist, and that's kind of what got you into that, and having that perspective, that's completely new. That actually isn't something I've heard of in a while. So I did want to ask. You did say that since you guys are kind of at the forefront of AI, you kind of get to see the pros and cons and the pitfalls. What are some of those pitfalls that you're seeing?
Uh, I think one of the pitfalls is that this idea that AI is going to solve all our problems, and it's sort of the panacea. Um, that's just not true. It's going to require a lot of tweaking, massaging, development, and nuancing over time. And the idea that AI is going to sort of replace us, it's not going to replace us. It's going to replace certain cognitive challenges that outstrip, the human brain, but it's going to complement what we do better, in terms of just, we're better at synthesis, but we lack the ability to handle the volume. And AI is very good with the volume and taking different volumes and putting them together. But the brain is still quite nimble at putting things together and synthesizing. And it's just this, banter that needs to go away.
Yeah, I very much agree. So, quick background on AI, maybe for the listeners. It's since about the 1950s, right? The idea of AI is really that you have computers doing human-like tasks, but what has been considered human-like has really evolved over time. So the very first, basic computers were just kind of interacting with environment, playing some games or whatever, Deep Blue for the chess.
Right.
But quickly, we saw, so basically you've got machine learning was the first iteration, and that's a lot of what the statistical, predictions, you see them all the time in healthcare and other fields. Just you do a lot of pre-processing, and then you take some basic information, let's say some lab values, some very structured information, then you try to predict some, let's say, outcomes. So, for example, sepsis risk in the ICU, that's a very common one. So lots of places have deployed this sort of thing locally. Then you get to the deep learning, which is now many layers, right? A neural network that has not just, one or a few layers like machine learning, but now it's so deep that it's not really understandable to the human brain. So, for example, in radiology, the argument was that there would be features not discernible to the human eye, right? Really deep features where you're extracting so much from the image that you can no longer really explain it. It's no longer texture or heterogeneity or edge detail, right? Which is what a machine learning model might do, but something much deeper. And so the challenge here is that you don't know what it's looking at. It's a black box, right? And so when you put in a bunch of data and then try to predict an outcome, it might do very well, but it might be completely looking at the wrong thing, right? So some of the classic examples are the horse versus dog silhouettes. And then when I looked at the salience map, it was actually the photographer, the horse photographer in the corner of the image, because all the training set, had the one horse photography kind of group of images. So in radiology, the similar analogous example is the chest x-rays in the ICU. So there was a model that did extremely well, supposedly better than humans, in predicting the outcome of ICU patients. And it did really well on these chest radiographs, something like 9%. And it turned out that they were looking not at anything in the image. They were looking at the way the view was done. So AP versus PA, meaning are they lying down or sitting up? And obviously, if a patient can sit up in the ICU, they're doing much better than if they're lying down. But that's not the information they were trying to look for. They were looking for something in the image itself. So again, like unless you do some QA on these models, you don't know what they're looking at. The other thing is they're extremely data hungry, right? You need ideally, at least a few thousand, but up to millions, billions of images, all annotated by experts, which, in healthcare, we don't have the time for that, right? A lot of what's done with the self-driving cars and the, internet stuff, it's all kind of publicly available, but you can't do that with physicians. They're very busy. And then the tasks are very narrow, meaning that you could train something to look for, let's say, lung nodule on a chest CT, but you could not use the same model to predict pneumonia, right? Which is to a human, right? If you learn one thing, you can kind of translate it to other similar areas, right? Or to bacterial pneumonia versus COVID, right? So it's not what we call generalizable in two ways. One is that the narrow task it's intended for cannot be transferred to another task directly. The other thing is that if it's trained on a certain population, so let's say, Rich and I work for a hospital in Missouri, right? If you try to translate that to New York or Texas or whatever, it's a different patient population. We don't have a training set that reflects that. And so, especially rare diseases, what we call the long tail problem, I'm not going to generalize. So everything that the FDA has cleared up to now is all machine or deep learning, and that's the big problem. So of something like 1,500 FDA cleared tools currently on the market, over 3/4 are radiology, and I would say they're almost all worthless. There might be like one or two that are, okay, acceptable. The rest are really like they don't not only do they not help radiologists, they actually waste a lot more time, because now the radiologist has to sit there, explain why the AI failed, and then basically explain it to, the patient, the other physicians. And so it takes more time and creates more burnout. So those are the cons, right, of AI. But what you're seeing in the literature is a huge potential, right? So with large language models or LLMs, right, we now have multimodal learning and much more generalist. So these foundation models from Anthropic and Google and Microsoft, they're trained on a vast corpora of data from like the internet, right? So it's publicly available stuff. Again, it's not peer-reviewed journals, right? So some of that stuff could be junk or even malicious, data that's been injected. So that is a risk. But there's a lot more flexibility. So you can do what's called transfer learning. That, okay, the stuff from the internet, right, what you see on Reddit or something, may not directly be related to healthcare, but some of it, right, some of that pattern recognition is possible. So then you could potentially fine tune it on, your particular healthcare data and extract a lot of insights. So we're seeing a lot of revolution. I would say the low-hanging fruit are going to be things like workforce optimization, right? Just like ambient notes, right? Being able to scribe instead of having, humans do that. A lot of the kind of lower level tasks like scheduling, billing, coding, right? So all of those things I think are the easy wins. But long term, I think, what Rich and I are working on, our vision really is that these rare diseases, right? Because the diagnostic odyssey is 8+ years, right? Sometimes 20 years. And by the time you actually get the answer, if you do, it's too late to help the patient. If there is a gene therapy or enzyme replacement, it may be too late for them to actually, they may be outside the therapeutic window. And so the idea is that, can you use AI? And we talk about this in our article, right? If you can use AI to really kind of develop a risk score and really sift through all of these unstructured notes, which are never going to be expert annotated, right? But all of this, we've got some nonspecific symptoms from primary care, we've got some labs. There's a few things that are deviation, and the signal may be weak, but together, right? You have some labs, you have some imaging, you have some notes, right? Can you predict, right, a genetic risk score, a threshold to say, okay, this person needs to go see Dr. Sidlow, right? This person needs to get an MRI and go see Dr. Ho, right? So if we could do that, it would really transform, care for rare diseases as well as the common diseases, right? Because we know that things like diabetes, stroke, dementia, right, there are genetic subtypes and they all respond differently to therapies, right? So basically, by elucidating a lot of these effects, I think that's really the true ultimate power of AI in healthcare, is to be able to create this more precision approach to diagnosis and therapy.
Oh yeah. Oh my God. Okay. Yeah. So well, the company that I work for, it's kind of the same. It's like we take as many studies, like actual studies done by mostly GWAS, and we put them into the algorithm with AI. So we've had experts kind of look through all of these studies, so they can get a not an accurate diagnosis, but like something close to a risk score. So that's kind of interesting that like we're all kind of trying to advance to this more accurate like AI, but also expert driven data. So, um, but you did write about the genopheno gap, and we talked about some of the pitfalls and some of the things that AI can and can't do. So, linking a genetic variant to what a patient actually looks and feels like, how close are we to AI being able to kind of bridge that reliably?
That's in a lot of ways the holy grail. Um, I think Mai-Lan already touched upon this, but what we need to be able to do is, in an ideal world, to be able to integrate different types of data. So I'll give you concrete examples. 3D imaging of surface anatomy and morphometrics, along with radiologic data, including MRI and uh, radiography, bone radiography, echocardiography, ultrasonography, retinograms, echocardiography. I said echocardiography. So being able to integrate all those different types of data, which are very different. Okay. Um, and then taking that and creating a phenotype and correlating that with what a person's genotype is. And I don't want to get into the weeds here unless we want to, but this is a big rabbit hole. And what when we talk about genotype, we're usually talking about a particular variant that's been identified that floats to the top. But what we need to understand is that whenever you sort of wake up a garden variety geneticist at 3 a.m. and you say, what do you think about this variant? Okay. An ambiguous variant. Do you think it's causing the problem or not? What they'll tell you is that it's working in context, but they can't define to you what the context is. Okay. And we're not at the point where we're able to say this variant, this particular finding genetically floated to the top, but why is this particular variant in one patient causing such a dramatic phenotype versus in the 99 other people who have the same thing, it's showing something that's watered down or even non-existent. We can't do that yet because we're not taking into account all the different variants within the 21,000 genes that we can sequence. So this is why the numbers here, the sheer computing challenges that we need to be able to overcome haven't been overcome. We need quantum computing for that, which is a sidebar. But answering your question directly, this idea of genotype phenotype is predicated on the ability to integrate massive amounts of data that are of different natures and to come up with an integrated whole. So it's a very difficult problem, but it's not insurmountable, which is why AI is the subject du jour.
Yeah, I very much agree with everything Rich mentioned. So I trained with someone who is known as the father of pediatric neuroradiology, and so his textbook, his seminal textbook in the field, has a section on like metabolic genetic disorders, and they make it seem like it's a one-to-one. That okay, this gene looks like this, like metachromatic leukodystrophy, adrenal leukodystrophy, and unfortunately, that's not how it works in practice, right? And we know that now. Um, and it makes sense because, even for a given monogenic disorder, right, you could have partial loss of function, complete loss of function, right? You could have epigenetic influences. And so, as Rich alluded to, right, it's really a multi-omic phenomenon. You've got transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics, and then you also have the exposome, right? So basically, you have the environmental interactions with the gene as well, and that's everything from prenatal life through birth onward. All of those, environmental aspects also affect, to a great deal. We know development, psychiatric, all of this stuff. Why do identical twins look different, right? So why do they have different personalities, right? So there's a lot of these things that have not been closely studied. Now, the historical literature in imaging genomics, right, has been these single gene disorders, OMIM, established case series or case reports where there's a single gene and a strong effect size, and then you do some functional genomic animal models, something to prove that it's causative. The issue there, right, is that most things are not monogenic, right? Even those disorders have some some other kind of environmental or contextual effects. And so once you get into even two gene or polygenic disorders and environmental interactions, you have to go to AI and quantum type approaches because you're never going to have enough training information and outcomes information. It's easy enough to collect the data, right? At this point, I mean, even on the research side, there's a lot of data you can generate, and all of these tech startups that are getting like, the proteomics multiple times a day and sensor data and all of this stuff, right, to try to estimate your exposome. Like, that's great, but then how do you analyze it, right? With the traditional deep learning techniques, you can't because you need an outcome. You need basically something to train that information to. And we don't have that. So I think as Rich mentioned, the only way we're going to be able to address this is with quantum because you have a massive search space. When you get to that level of magnitude, you're going to need any speed up that you can get in terms of, improving the search space and coming up with probabilistic, most likely kind of lowest energy outcomes. And that's where quantum excels.
Right. Because we're also thinking about this in terms of, I won't say binary, but discrete values. And what we need to sort of get used to is that what we're dealing with are continua. Each, we look at genetic variants as sort of like yes or no, but it's not like that. And we have to look at things as sort of like different spectra, and we have to be able to compare different spectra with different spectra. So that's why the whole quantum discussion is really really du jour.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, a lot of the genetic sequences we look at is like it's like a one-to-one, but I don't think that's the case. Everything seems a lot more complex than that, or it should be.
Right.
You do flag in your paper that three real-world barriers: the biological model fidelity, the manufacturing bottlenecks, and economic models. So, which of those three worries you the most right now?
Yes. They're all really huge issues. I mean, it's hard to sort of talk about one without the other. I don't think you can really distinguish.
Yeah, agreed. I think they're all challenges in different ways, right? One is kind of like the biological, the AI ability to model real life. Because ideally, right, we see the FDA push and NIH toward less animal testing because we see that, from mouse model to human, I think it was something like 90% of those candidate drugs fail, 95, because there's not enough correlation, right? So then you can go to medium, large animals, but then it's much harder to maintain, create those models, all of these things. So if we could do more in vitro or even in silico modeling, it would be great, right? And you see these articles about like organoid on a chip, human on a chip, right? So there's a lot of that kind of work going on. Again, I think this is where, quantum will probably play a role because none of this is deterministic. It's all probabilistic, right? And then as you get more and more interactions, right, it's really just you know, every single person, right, when you look at the drug, the off-target effects, the drug response, all of the, side effects, it's very, very complex. Um, but so yeah, one question is the biological accuracy of the model. That's a very, important fundamental question. But then in terms of operationalizing, like even if you could find a drug candidate, right? Making it at a GMP facility, getting it distributed correctly, right? And then incentivizing that, right? So basically at the end, right, having the policies in place, right? And a sustainable financial model because even if it's an interesting, research question, no scientist or, company is going to go in on this if they don't have, return on investment, right? At least neutral, right? But, over time, it's got to be a net positive. So I think they're all kind of part of a, spectrum or a pipeline where one kind of drives the other, but they're all work in all of them is really necessary.
And I'll also add that I think, as dirty as this may sound in quotations, I think that the genetic testing companies have to be integrated into this pipeline because they're going to be sort of like the first contact with whether or not there's a problem or not. And if you wait for all the intervening steps between the testing to get to the researcher, to get to the manufacturer, et cetera, if you wait for that natural history to occur, the patient's already taken hits. So what would be ideal, even though I'm not an antitrust lawyer and I don't understand the legalities of this or anything like that, but the point is, um, the diagnosis and the diagnostic process should be the first domino in a long series of going from diagnosis to provable drug that can be applied to the patient on an N of one basis in series, over and over and over again in an iterative way for different patients.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if one thing that we mentioned in our article is that all of the tools that we're proposing, they all exist in some commercial or open source form, right? But no one's orchestrated them, right? So it's really that end to end thing, all the way from kind of capturing the risk scores, doing the sequencing, analyzing the sequencing, bringing together the multimodal data, matching them to a therapy or clinical trial, right, in a timely manner. Like all of those are available in some form, right? But it's very difficult to orchestrate over that entire system, very complex healthcare system. And so there has to be some kind of economic, financial incentivization to drive that. Otherwise, it's just not going to be sustainable.
Right now, a lot of that is foundation driven, and who ends up making the connection between a patient and a foundation? Me. All right. And that should not be the case. This should be, this should start at the genetic testing level. And this whole circle of interaction should be predetermined and trivialized. The operationalization of this should be trivialized.
Kind of like what you guys said about how it's already available, but it goes through so many channels that it takes forever to get to someone. That's kind of in an ideal world, it really shouldn't be that way. I'm thinking about like all the genetic testing companies that, yeah, they have the information, but it has to go through all the proper channels before it even gets to the person that needs to hear it.
So what's
That's
happening? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
what's happening now is you have these things called sponsored tests where pharmaceutical companies plug in with genetic companies and they underwrite the genetic testing for something that they offer a drug for, with the idea that that the genetic testing companies advertise this to geneticists and endocrinologists and orthopedists or whomever, and get a lot of testing done. By doing this, the case finding is the work of the case finding is done by the doctors out in the field, the subspecialists in the field, based on this collusion between the pharmaceutical company and the testing company. The problem is that these tests are then ordered non-specifically, and John Q. geneticist who has to often navigate the results of these tests that the people actually ordering them don't know how to interpret. So this is an attempt to try and operationalize this, except it's only incorporating a couple of these elements as opposed to the whole whole circle of life, so to speak.
I did want to ask. It sounds like we're making the claim that pharmacogenetics is kind of bought out.
I don't, it's all bad. I think that the system is not fully fleshed out, and it needs to incorporate a lot more elements that the paper addresses. It's a much more complex process. And you could walk away sort of indignant and say, "Ooh, this is kind of gray or shady." I'm not implying that for a second. What I'm saying is it's incomplete.
I can definitely probably agree with that. Yeah, there's definitely more needs to be done there. But you did talk about already, and I did want to go back because in the paper it describes that the average rare disease patient is waiting like 5 to 8 years, seeing more than 8 specialists before getting a diagnosis. So, can you kind of put us through like the scenario of like what that actually looks like for a patient and a family? Kind of humanize it for us a little bit.
Gosh, imagine a family that has been taking care of a kid with lots of different needs, um, wrangling with the schools to get therapies or having to do private hire if they have the means, and just going through life without answers and not knowing how to optimize the care for their kid. And then this happens, gosh, every other week, every 3, 4 weeks. It's a very common thing where the kid's already a teenager. The kid's already, you know, almost at the point where there are decisions being made about what to do after they become an adult. Are they going to live at home? Are they going to live in some other kind of supervised living or something like that? And they come to me, still don't have a diagnosis. The reason why they don't have a diagnosis can come from many different avenues. Parents were reluctant to get testing. They didn't have a great experience back when the kid was very young, or they did everything. And it just so happens that in the last every 5 years, you're seeing these explosions of new technology, and they haven't had the latest iteration of testing, and they get re-referred to a geneticist, and I happen to be the one that's there, and we end up finding out what's going on. I mean, this is a common occurrence. Is there anyone to blame for this? No, I don't think that's the way to look at it. I think that's circumstantially things have been in evolution for a long time, and in many cases, the parents get very frustrated, or they're just like, they're not particularly faithful of the process. And truth, I can't blame them in a lot of cases. They've been failed. They've been failed multiple times.
Yeah, and as someone who has read through hundreds of pages of these kind of notes of the diagnostic odyssey, I can concur with what Rich is saying. So imagine, the child has some non-specific symptoms. They go to their primary care, and we know that primary care physicians are, really understaffed, right? They are a lot of demand, and they can't keep up with all this literature. I mean, there are what 1 to 2 at least new monogenic disorders being discovered and described every week, right? So that's impossible, right? Even for geneticists, you have to keep, looking at the literature and doing reanalyses and things. So they're overwhelmed. Someone comes with developmental delay or discoordination, ataxia, whatever. And it's just like, oh, maybe they'll grow out of it, or, maybe it's, some normal like bread and butter thing, like a flu or a whatever, right? So they're not aware of these rare diseases. So it basically gets ignored for a while. Maybe the symptoms start to get worse. So then they start referring them to different specialists, but not a geneticist, right? So it might be, okay, they have some high liver function tests. So then they go to a hepatologist. Maybe they get a biopsy, right? It's non-specific. They don't know what it is. Then they go back. Then they go to urologist for some, GU symptoms. So they just keep getting referred to different specialists, coming back without an answer, wasting a lot of time and resources, wasting, valuable years of function. And then they continue to regress. Maybe they move somewhere else. They go see other physicians. And like, it just goes on and on like that. And then maybe at some point they get lucky enough to see a geneticist, get the testing, maybe get imaging if needed. And I kind of find it ironic, but also telling that a lot of the, in the last couple of years, a lot of the families have diagnosed their own rare diseases by using ChatGPT and similar chatbots. So it shows the power of like LLMs to bring together these vast corpora. If you have certain symptoms, right, maybe each one is non-specific, but that combination is very powerful. And is this diagnostic? No, but the fact that it is something probably genetic is a flag to go to a geneticist earlier, because geneticists, medical geneticists and radiologists and other specialists are also very, very, short-staffed and understaffed nationally, and the situation will not improve in the future. We don't have enough trainees graduating to replace, and actually supplement the increasing volumes of referrals. So how can we address all of the, global workforce shortages with what we have, right? There is going to be a synergy between AI and physicians, but basically, how do you get the experts involved earlier? What are the most probabilistic, high risk patients that need to see these experts, right? So I think that's where it's really very powerful to say, okay, all of these, maybe to each of those in isolation, signs and symptoms is not specific, but together they create a much more probabilistic approach.
So just to dovetail with what Dr. Ho is saying, um, the broad application of LLMs as they relate to rare disease, I think is going to ultimately, if they're done correctly, be able to create pretty much what we call clinical prediction models for rare diseases. I've already seen this done in a couple cases, and what's going to happen, hopefully, is just focusing on the EMR, electronic medical record, applications of LLMs on top of EMRs, is that as syndromes are as these tools are applied to focus on different rare diseases, clinical prediction models will be created. And those clinical prediction models, if there are enough of them, if they represent enough rare diseases, can be sort of embedded as a suite on top of the EMR, sort of like as a standard feature. Okay. And what will end up happening is that the outcomes of this analysis will get spit out to the doctors that are looking at the EMR. It's just like the same way you have like alarms saying, this drug and Coumadin don't mix. At some point, if enough data is there, it'll start, ringing a bell, ringing an alarm on the side saying, this kid is a high, scores very high for Robinow syndrome. Okay. Maybe you should, take a look at that. That's kind of like, the ideal, when just looking at, large language models.
And we've seen some, actually, back to what Rich said about the morphometry. So there are some commercial products which do, facial phenotyping, even just from a 2D. You can do photogrammetry, kind of like a 3D surface, but that's kind of limited. People don't want to, go in and get that whole scan. So even just from a smartphone video, kind of probabilistically saying, this part, the interocular distance, all this stuff, and then trying to provide a probability. So it's never going to be definitive, right? But similar to radiology models, a lot of them will give the confidence level, the percentage match. But I
Right.
think where those commercial tools really struggled in terms of deployment was that they weren't getting enough feedback from experts, from geneticists, because when the cases were right, that's fine. Some of the common stuff like Down, trisomies, fetal alcohol.
Right.
But then some of the really rare ones, you need confirmation, like what was the actual diagnosis, which could be years, right, to figure out. And then, were they right or wrong? And the geneticists were just so busy, they didn't have time to provide this feedback. So that's where the models struggle with, number one, training data, and then number two is feedback, right? Expert feedback.
So I've given this particular issue a lot of thought, and not that this is necessarily going to come to statistical significance in every case, but one of the ways to create the training data sets for rare disease is to circle back to the foundations where a lot of these patients are aggregated. And if you can sort of set up like a lot of these foundations have annual meetings. And if you've got several hundred people already there and you can do the deep phenotyping that you need, if a renal ultrasound hasn't been done, you can do it right there or get consent to access it from whatever EMR they come from. You can do some of the other processes that you need to create this multi-omic and multimodal data, because you have all these people together. And if you just, set up the stations and do everything on everybody and aggregate that and then apply the computer tools to come up with the definition and the ranges of the error bars for each of those definitions, that's probably as good as it's going to get for diseases that have 10, 100, 1,000 people in the world. And that could serve as a foundation for a lot of these diseases. And then, whether you want to look at just, facial recognition or some other aspect of it, you could, and you have good error bars based on a very good data set.
Oh, okay. Yes, that actually kind of brings me to my next question. It's a little bit of a pivot, but for the functional medicine doctors and integrated practitioners listening, who may be already ordering genetics and multi-omic panels, like what would you say they should be doing better or differently based on what you know?
Learn genetics. All right. I'm not trying to be, difficult, but learn genetics, learn what a VUS is, learn what's real, learn what's not, and understand that the complexity of what we're dealing with is orders of magnitude more difficult than any one of us understand. So this idea of sort of vortexing everything down to being a function of one gene or another or a set of genes, that is just, you're not understanding the system. You're just sort of ignoring the forest for the trees. All right. This is really, really complicated, and take things in with their requisite complexity. That's the simplest way I can put it.
Yeah, and I'm a little removed from the ordering process as a radiologist, but I would say that take patients seriously. Like if they're continuing to complain of things, you're actually seeing regression, delay, loss of milestones. Some of these things are much higher probability for genetic. So, and don't be afraid to consult or refer to an expert, because these are very challenging cases. So, Rich and I will regularly discuss complex cases, and sometimes neither of us, we know that it's probably genetic, but we can't prove it with the current, clinical testing that's out there, right? So it becomes kind of this odyssey where clearly there are features that are higher probability, but our technology is not there yet. And every time it's a multidisciplinary thing. So we run a regular genetics conference where we have everyone coming in to discuss the different angles and perspectives, and we all learn something every time. So it's a very, fast evolving field. And I think, when, because the primary care, these people are so busy, right? I don't think you can expect to be on top of all of these disorders, particularly the rare ones. So I would say don't be afraid to refer these cases onward. If you really believe, that the family has, compelling symptoms and that there could be something more, beyond the traditional expertise.
Right. Right.
Perfect. I did also, I wanted to ask you guys' opinion and if you could leave, our listeners with something about AI and where should they lean on it and when they should not. I know we touched on it, but we can put it in, kind of layman's terms form. Like what would you say?
I think the simplest way to put it is your doctor's still your doctor. And we are still in search mode as to what tools will allow us to serve you, John Q patient or Jane Q patient, best. And bringing AI from the outside to us isn't going to help us. It's going to confuse us. We have to figure out what works for us and allows us to engage in our cognitive work and make it more efficient for your benefit. So this is very much a field that is an evolution. And I think what needs to happen is that the power of time and experience and deferring to expertise will winnow out the losers and allow us to focus in on the winners and use the stuff as efficiently as possible. The background noise doesn't help.
Yeah, I think, AI is advancing exponentially, and we see the societal, social technical impacts of that. So even much more so in general society than in healthcare, where I think the effects are delayed because we worry about patient safety, privacy, accuracy, and there's a lot of really highly honed expertise. But there's no doubt that AI will impact how we go forward, and I think that can be utilized either positively or negatively. So I think the negative implications are what you're kind of seeing in society at large is that by using GPT and these other LLMs, people are not really learning things. They're kind of just blindly accepting what the model tells them. And if you know anything about AI, you'll realize that it's basically regurgitating what the most likely, word string is based on your prompt from the internet, which has a lot of junk, right? So I think you have to treat it with a grain of salt. I think it's definitely fine to use it just to sort of answer common questions, to kind of investigate things at a first level, but it doesn't replace the experts at all. And the people, like Rich and myself, there are a lot of people who are really working hard to understand, well, a lot of people, honestly, like society is kind of being dumbed down by AI, the way that things are going, because it's just so easy, right? You don't have to think. And that's not how humans learn. And so there is a kind of minority of us who are both physicians and otherwise who are trying to understand how do we synergize with AI, right? How do we actually elevate the potential of both human and AI? And again, I think a lot of that is going to be, in the early stage, just more efficient, smooth operations. But in the long term, it's going to be precision medicine. So how do we take a lot of that data and, bring it together and integrate it in a way that's meaningful for accelerating disease diagnosis and therapy for everyone and being more proactive in care? So I guess I would say that, overall AI can both help and hurt. And so I think it's fine to use as a kind of something on a casual basis, but it's never going to replace true expertise. And, the way in which we end up utilizing it long term has to be very intentional.
I agree. I agree. So for the next 5 years, where does the rare disease diagnostic landscape look like if things go well, in your opinion?
As a geneticist, I'm obviously focused on testing technology, and there are now commercially available several layers of testing. Certain companies have them packaged, certain companies are still parsing them out individually. Um, I'm hoping that in the next 5 years, the ability to do multi-omic testing with insurance support is going to become routine. It's only starting right now, but it needs to be routine with the understanding that it's going to help, but it's not going to be everything. Everything we've talked about today should make that, should have made that eminently clear. But that's really the next foray in terms of the nitty gritty of what I do. But, obviously we're talking about AI today, and the winnowing process that I talked about and the issues of integration and finding out exactly where the sweet spot is of integrating these AI tools with everything else we've talked about. That's like front and center. It's happening in at light speed, today and for the future. So that's also really, really, really important.
Yeah, agreed. So the natural history of genomic sequencing, you've seen those graphs from like the National Genomic Institute where you have this exponential decrease, right, in cost. And so all the time, genomic sequencing is getting faster, cheaper, more accessible. And so right now we're doing a lot of when I started my career, a decade ago in practice, right, it was mostly gene panels or single gene testing. And that's been almost completely replaced by whole exome and whole genome. And so most of what we're doing now is like second generation, so-called next generation sequencing. But then there's a lot of third generation long read that's starting to become of interest and has a lot more information regarding, like large, chromosomal rearrangements, trisomies, things like that. And then of course the multi-omics, so proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, a lot of that stuff is really research/investigational right now. But that's going to start to enter the clinical scenario as it becomes more commercially viable. And then, of course, how do you analyze all that, right? So that's really the key, right? You can collect all this stuff, but how do you actually integrate it in a seamless fashion, right? There's going to have to be some AI/quantum tools to do that and to continue doing reanalyses to keep up with the literature, maybe the effects of environment as well over time. But really, it's at this point, it's interesting because the diagnostic technologies are far ahead of the therapies in terms of, development stage. And yet, if you look at the commercial market, it's many orders of magnitude higher in the rare disease therapeutics than the diagnostics, right? So there needs to be a linking up of those two pieces, right? You need to go seamlessly from diagnostic pipeline and analysis to basically bringing them in smoothly into the most probable therapy. A lot of that could even be with drug repurposing, that things that are already FDA cleared, right? So really, that's, I think in the next 5 years, certainly that's going to be the focus. That really trying to hone that integration of that pipeline to make it a much smoother transition for patients, because the even though people, the vendors have really focused on the therapeutic side of the market because there's a lot more return on investment in pharmaceuticals, they're finding that they can't enroll the patients, there aren't enough, or they're not finding them early enough in their therapeutic window to actually make an effective difference in clinical trials. And so now there's a lot more interest in trying to capture those patients, upstream and figure out how they can find people who will actually respond to therapy.
Right.
Well, thank you for sharing. I did want to ask, so for the listeners who want to follow your work, where can they find you guys?
I'm not a huge social media person. Um, the probably the best place to find me is my email address at Valley Children's Hospital is rsidlow@valleychildrens.org, and my email address at Missouri is rsgfg@umsystem.health.edu. So if people want to reach out, just email me.
Yeah, I'm also not a big social media person. I am on LinkedIn, but my email is mailanho@gmail.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us. Thank y'all for tuning into the Better by the Numbers podcast. And if today's conversation opened your eyes to what's possible at the intersection of AI, genomics, and clinical care, please share it with a colleague. And we'll catch you on the next one. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
If you are interested in genetic testing, blood work panels, or other resources for your practice or business, check out lifemetrics.com.